They thought they could steal my home by framing me with a massive criminal accusation and a trail of illegal substances. They didn't realize that in this house, the only thing more dangerous than the secrets buried in the basement was the woman who held the key to their entire organized scheme. I stood in the center of the living room, the hardwood floors creaking under the weight of 5 people who, only 3 months ago, had been my family. Now, they looked at me as if I were a common trespasser. My ex-husband, Mark, stood slightly behind his father, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet my gaze. It was pathetic, really. We had been married for 8 years, and the house we stood in was the centerpiece of our life together. Or so I thought. "You need to be out by Friday, Sarah," Mark's father, Arthur, boomed. He was a man who used his voice to compensate for his lack of moral compass. He paced around the granite kitchen island like he was inspecting a property he was about to buy, not a home he had no legal right to be in. "We've discussed this. You're no longer a part of this family. Mark is moving on, and we need this house for his new life. It's only right that the family assets return to the family name." I didn't blink. I had spent the last 2 weeks preparing for this exact moment. I had watched them change from grieving in-laws into vultures, picking apart the pieces of a life that hadn't even finished cooling yet. When Mark and I first bought this place, my name was the only one on the mortgage. My inheritance, the money from my grandmother, had covered the entire down payment. Mark had argued at the time that he didn't want his name on the deed until he could contribute equally, a day that never actually came. I had been naive, thinking that in a marriage, it didn't matter whose name was on the paper. "It isn't a family asset, Arthur," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It's mine. I paid for it. I pay the taxes. I pay the utilities. Your son lived here by my grace, and quite frankly, that grace expired the moment he decided he couldn't keep his vows." Mark flinched. His mother, Brenda, let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. She was clutching her designer handbag as if it were a shield against reality. "Oh, don't play the martyr, dear. We know you're hiding things. We know you've been involved in some questionable dealings. Mark told us all about your little side projects, the ones that brought unidentified packages into this house. We've been talking to a few people in the service, and they'd be very interested to know what you've been doing behind closed doors." My heart skipped a beat, but not for the reason she wanted. This was the strategy they had hinted at in their text messages, the heavy artillery. They were trying to manufacture a scenario that would land me in deep trouble. They were framing me for things I'd never even touched. "Are you threatening me with a false report?" I asked, keeping my tone ice cold. "Do you realize how serious an attempt to break someone's life with a criminal accusation is? If you try to pin a fake charge on me, I have enough documentation to show exactly who brought those packages into this house. And let me tell you, it wasn't me." Arthur stepped closer, invading my personal space. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. "Nobody is going to believe you, Sarah. You're a bitter ex-wife with a history of isolation. We've already made calls. We've already explained to the local authorities that you've been acting erratic, holding on to illegal weapons, and harboring suspicious activity. The service internal audit team is already looking into the history of this address. You'll be lucky if you walk away with just a record. You're looking at decades behind bars." I looked at them, each one of them. They had spent the last few days systematically dismantling my reputation in the neighborhood, painting me as a criminal mastermind to cover for the fact that they wanted my property. They thought they could scare me into handing over the deed and walking away with nothing. "You really think a threat like that is going to make me hand over my life's work?" I asked, crossing my arms. "You've miscalculated. You think I'm the same woman you bullied into silence for 8 years. You're wrong." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I didn't open it yet. I just tapped it against my palm. "You've been so busy trying to build a case against me that you forgot to check the county records. You assumed that, because I was married, the house was communal. You assumed that, because you have connections, you could dictate the law. But the law doesn't care about your family name, Arthur. It cares about signatures. That piece of paper is a fabrication, Brenda spat, her composure finally slipping. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched to snatch the envelope from me. I stepped back, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. Don't, I warned. If you touch me, that's assault. And you're already skating on thin ice with this whole criminal accusation narrative you've been spinning. I walked toward the foyer, the group following me like a pack of wolves that had realized the prey wasn't going to run. I stopped at the hall table where I kept my mail. I turned to face them, the envelope still held tight. "You want the house?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You want to push me out because you think you're above the law? Well, here is the reality of the situation." I ripped the seal off the envelope and pulled out the original deed, but I didn't hand it over. Instead, I pulled out a second document, a notarized letter from a firm they didn't know I had hired. As I unfolded the papers, the front door rattled. Someone was pounding on the glass, hard. I glanced toward the foyer window and saw 3 men in dark, nondescript uniforms standing on my porch, their expressions stern, their hands resting near their tactical vests. Arthur's face went pale. "What is this? Did you call them?" I didn't answer. I just watched as the front door swung open and the lead officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Arthur. "Arthur Miller?" the officer asked, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the falsification of official documents and the illegal submission of a coordinated attempt to break a life with a massive criminal charge. You're coming with us." The room spun. Mark looked at the officer, then back at me, his mouth agape. I realized then that my nightmare wasn't just about losing my house. It was about the fact that they had been orchestrating something much darker, and I had just walked right into the middle of their final, catastrophic mistake. The air in the hallway turned static, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a lightning strike. The officer who had called out Arthur's name took a step forward, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the hardwood. Behind him, 2 other agents stood guard, their presence effectively turning my home into a crime scene. Arthur's face, usually flush with an arrogant, reddening ego, drained of all color until he looked like a wax statue left out in the sun. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his bravado crumbling like dry parchment. "You have the wrong person. This is about a property dispute, not whatever it is you're implying." The lead officer didn't blink. He pulled a tablet from his vest and tapped the screen twice. "We have extensive recordings, Mr. Miller. We have proof of a coordinated effort to fabricate evidence, to plant materials, and to file a false report with the intent to ruin this woman's life. Attempting to frame an innocent civilian for harboring illegal substances and prohibited hardware is not a property dispute. It is an act of organized deception. And frankly, we're done playing games." Mark, who had been hiding behind his mother, suddenly found his voice, though it was little more than a thin, jagged tremor. "Sarah, tell them you're making this up. Tell them we were just talking. You can't let them do this to my father." I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw the utter hollowness behind his eyes. For years I had thought he was simply weak, easily led by his father's iron hand. Now, seeing the panic in his face, I realized he wasn't just a victim of his father's influence. He was a silent partner in the schemes that were intended to destroy me. "I told you, Mark," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I told you that if you kept pushing, there would be consequences. You thought I was bluffing. You thought that if you threw enough mud at the wall, some of it would stick, and I'd be too afraid to fight back. You were wrong." Brenda let out a shrill, hysterical laugh that turned into a sob. She grabbed the lead officer's arm, but he shook her off with a flick of his wrist. "Do you have any idea who we are?" she screamed, her designer bag hitting the floor with a thud. "We have people in the city, people who handle these internal audits. You can't just walk into a private home and demand an arrest without a proper review. My husband has done nothing but protect his family's interests." "Your husband's interests included an organized scheme to commit perjury and obstruct justice," the officer replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "And as for the internal audit, let's just say the team conducting the review reached a very different conclusion. After viewing the surveillance logs from the smart home cameras, you were so sure you'd disabled." The mention of the cameras made Mark's head snap toward the ceiling, his eyes widening in pure horror. I had upgraded the security system 3 months ago, the exact moment I realized he was hiding something. He thought he had cut the power to the external servers, but he hadn't realized that the data was being backed up to a secure cloud server that wasn't even hosted in this country. Everything was there: the conversations in the garage, the secret meetings in the study, and most importantly, the moment they had brought in the illegal items they were planning to use as proof of my guilt. Arthur looked at me, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate fury. "You did this on purpose," he hissed. "You let us believe we were winning. You watched us walk into the trap." "I let you show me who you really were," I replied, standing my ground as the officers closed the distance around them. "I didn't lead you anywhere, Arthur. You walked this path all on your own." The officers moved with practiced efficiency. Handcuffs clicked in the quiet foyer, a sound that, in any other context, would have been terrifying, but right then, it sounded like justice. As they led Arthur and the stunned, weeping Brenda toward the door, Mark remained frozen, his eyes darting between the officers and me. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice desperate. "We can fix this. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, you still love me, don't you?" The absurdity of the question was almost laughable. I stepped toward him, the deed to the house still gripped tightly in my hand. "Love requires trust, Mark, and it certainly requires a lack of organized schemes to destroy the person you're supposedly committed to. You lost your chance at love the moment you decided that my life was a fair price for your inheritance." The officer grabbed Mark by the arm, and for a second he resisted, stumbling back against the wall. "Wait," Mark choked out, looking at the lead officer. "I have information. I can give you the names of the people who actually supplied the goods. I can help you with the rest of the network. Just don't put me in the same cell as them." The lead officer paused, looking back at Mark with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Cooperation is for people who haven't spent the last 48 hours actively scrubbing evidence, Mr. Miller. We already have the names. We already have the network. What we have now is you, and you are exactly where you belong." As they shoved Mark through the front door, the house finally began to feel like my own again. The air seemed cleaner, the shadows less oppressive. I walked to the door and watched them be loaded into the back of an unmarked vehicle. The neighbors were peering through their curtains, the entire street silent as the spectacle unfolded. I turned back into the hallway, ready to lock the door and finally breathe. But as I reached for the handle, my eyes caught a small, blinking light on the floor near the mudroom. It was a digital recorder, one I didn't recognize. I picked it up, feeling a cold shiver crawl up my spine. It was still running. I pressed the playback button, thinking it was perhaps something they had dropped. But the voice that came out of the tiny speaker made my blood run cold. It was a voice I didn't recognize, gravelly and distorted, speaking in a low, rhythmic tone. The Millers were sloppy, but they were the perfect distraction. Everything is set for the second phase. If the house isn't vacated by midnight, the contents of the basement will be triggered. Sarah doesn't know she's sitting on a powder keg. My heart stopped. I ran toward the basement door, the floor beneath me feeling suddenly, violently fragile. As I grabbed the handle, the floorboards groaned, and I realized with sickening clarity that the vibration wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from beneath the concrete. The metallic tang of ozone and old dust hit me the moment I pulled the basement door open. The stairs groaned, sounding like bones shifting under too much weight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the hum of the house's central heating. Every step down felt like a gamble with my own existence. But the warning on that recording was too specific to ignore. The basement was a labyrinth of storage crates and old furniture, the graveyard of a marriage I had spent years trying to maintain. I moved toward the back corner, near the foundation wall where the water heater sat, shielded by a stack of moth-eaten moving boxes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight, but I focused on the floor. There, tucked behind a heavy wooden workbench, was a floorboard that didn't align with the rest. The wood was slightly raised, and there was a faint bluish glow pulsing from the gap between the joists. I dropped to my knees, shoving the boxes aside. My breath hitched. Beneath the floorboard sat a device I had only ever seen in training manuals. A complex, modular timer connected to a series of packages. They weren't just trying to frame me. They had turned my own home into a trap, a lethal bargaining chip in a game I hadn't even known I was playing. And the timer wasn't just ticking. It was flickering, the sequence speeding up as if it were reacting to the movement in the house. I scrambled backward, but my heel caught on a loose wire running along the floor. My heart jumped into my throat. The wire wasn't just a connection, it was a tripwire. The second it pulled taut, a sharp electronic beep echoed through the basement. The pulse on the device turned a steady, angry crimson. I didn't think. I moved. I scrambled up the stairs, my lungs burning, the wood beneath my feet feeling like it might give way at any second. I lunged for the basement door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt just as a dull, muffled thump vibrated through the floorboards of the entire house. It wasn't an explosion, not yet. It was something else. A hiss, the sound of gas escaping somewhere behind the walls. I sprinted toward the kitchen, my phone already in my hand. I dialed the emergency services, but the screen flickered, showing no service. My eyes darted to the Wi-Fi router on the wall. The lights were dead. They had jammed the signal. I was trapped in a smart home that had been compromised, cut off from the outside world while a countdown I couldn't see was silently unfolding in the foundation. I grabbed my keys from the counter and ran for the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pulled with everything I had, my muscles straining, but the electronic lock, the one I had synced to the security system, was deadlocked, frozen in the locked position as part of a catastrophic system failure. I was a prisoner. I turned back, desperate for a window, but the storm shutters, which I'd installed for security after a break-in attempt years ago, were rolling down, one by one, sealing the house like a tomb. The house began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. I knew I had minutes, maybe less. I looked at the basement door where the muffled hiss was growing louder, then at the sealed front door. I remembered the old floor safe in the attic, the one my grandmother had left me, the one Mark had never been able to open. It contained the original physical deeds, and I suddenly remembered an old-fashioned emergency release for the home's external security overrides. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time, my ears ringing with the sound of the house's systems failing. The walls were heating up. I reached the attic, throwing the heavy wooden door open, and scanned the cluttered space. I dove into the corner where the safe sat, covered by a tarp. I punched in the combination, my grandmother's birthday, and the heavy door groaned open. I reached inside, but instead of the release lever, my fingers brushed against a cold, hard, rectangular object. I pulled it out. It wasn't the release mechanism. It was a file, marked with the emblem of a private investigative firm I hadn't hired, and inside were photos. Not of me, not of the house, but of the internal security team that had come for Arthur today. I realized with a jolt of horror that the men who had taken the Millers hadn't been agents at all. They were players in the same game, a rival faction that had intercepted the Millers' plans to clear the board. My rescue had been nothing more than a tactical extraction of a scapegoat, and they had left me here to clean up the mess they'd created. I heard a sound from downstairs, a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the front door. Not a battering ram, but the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone coming up the stairs. The locks hadn't been triggered by a system failure. They had been overridden from the outside. I pressed myself into the corner of the attic, holding the file to my chest, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. The attic door creaked open, just a fraction. A beam of white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping over the clutter until it landed directly on me. "You were never supposed to find this, Sarah," a voice said, a voice that was chillingly familiar. It was the lead officer, but he wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. He was holding a small silver remote, and he was smiling. "But since you've opened the box, I suppose we have to accelerate the schedule." He stepped into the light, and I saw what he was holding in his other hand. It was the detonator for the house, and he was leaning against the only exit, watching me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "Tell me," he whispered, stepping closer, "did you really think the deed to the house was the only thing you owned? Because everything inside these walls now belongs to us, and we really don't like trespassers." As he raised the remote, the floorboards beneath me shifted, and I felt the entire attic begin to tilt. My balance failed, and I slid toward the open gap in the attic floor, staring down into the darkness of the second-floor hallway, realizing that the structure was being systematically collapsed from the inside out. Just as he pressed the button, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows behind him, someone I hadn't expected to see for another 10 years. The floor lurched at a violent 45-degree angle, throwing me against the rafters. Dust, decades old and thick as soot, choked the air, turning the attic into a blinding, suffocating haze. The man, the one who had masqueraded as an officer, stumbled, his grip on the remote loosening for a split second, but his eyes remained locked on the shadow emerging from behind him. The figure stepped into the dim, flickering light cast by the failing emergency floods. It was my brother, Leo. The last time I saw him, he was being led away in a transport van, convicted of a crime he hadn't committed, sacrificed by the same organized scheme that Arthur had been a part of. The official records had said he was in a secure facility 3 states away, undergoing a long-term rehabilitation program. But here he was, dressed in tactical darks, his jaw set, and his eyes burning with a cold, focused fury I had never seen before. "Drop it," Leo said. His voice wasn't the frantic, desperate tone of a brother. It was the clinical command of a soldier. The man in the tactical vest laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You're a ghost, Leo. You're supposed to be rotting behind high-security walls. If you're here, then the entire internal network has been compromised. Do you have any idea what that means for both of you?" "It means we're finished playing the victims," Leo replied, stepping closer. He didn't look at me, but his presence was a shield. "I've been tracking this network for 3 years. I let them think they had control over the Millers, and I let them think they had control over Sarah. But this house? It's not a prison, it's the server." My head spun. "What are you talking about?" I managed to choke out, clutching the file to my chest as the attic joists shrieked under the mounting tension. The house was settling, sinking into the foundation. Leo's eyes flickered toward me, full of a brief, searing apology. "Sarah, this property wasn't chosen by accident. When you bought it, you were chosen as the blind host for the archive. The deeds, the basement, the structure, it's all a storage unit for the group's digital ledger. The reason they wanted you out isn't because of the property value. It's because the ledger is nearing its threshold, and they need to wipe the host to prevent the authorities from finding the trail." The man in the vest raised the remote again, his thumb hovering over the button. "Enough talk. If I can't have the data, nobody gets it. I'll turn this entire street into a crater." "They won't let you," Leo countered, his hand moving to his side. He produced a small metallic device that hummed with a high-pitched vibration. "I've already initiated a hard override. The detonator signal is being rerouted to the internal power grid. You press that button and you don't blow up the house. You blow up yourself." The man's confidence wavered. He stared at the remote, then at Leo's device, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "You wouldn't." "Try me," Leo said. In that heartbeat of silence, the floor dropped another foot. The support beam behind me snapped, and I felt the attic floor tearing away from the wall. I lunged for the edge, my fingers catching on a piece of exposed piping. I hung there, dangling over the second-floor landing, the file slipping from my grasp and fluttering down into the abyss of the collapsing hallway. Leo lunged, but not for the man. He lunged for me. The man, seeing his chance, slammed his thumb down on the remote. A blinding flash of white light erupted from the basement, a concussive blast that didn't shatter the walls, but seemed to consume the sound itself. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the entire structure. I felt a massive, invisible hand shove me backward. I fell, the world spinning in a vortex of splinters and plaster, slamming into the hard surface of the hallway floor below. I lay there, winded, my vision swimming. The house was deathly silent now. The hum was gone. The smell of ozone had been replaced by the stench of scorched wiring. I dragged myself up, my ribs screaming in protest. The attic was gone, a gaping hole in the ceiling where the sky peeked through, dark and starless. Leo was nowhere to be seen. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and limped toward the debris pile. I moved a heavy, charred beam, searching for any sign of him. Beneath the wreckage, I found the remote, smashed into a dozen pieces. But next to it, I found a leather-bound notebook, scorched at the edges, with my name written on the cover in my brother's handwriting. I opened it, my heart pounding against my bruised ribs. The first page was a map, a layout of the underground network that connected this house to a series of properties across the city. And at the bottom of the page, written in fresh ink, were 3 words: "They are coming." A sound echoed from the front of the house. It wasn't the sound of a police siren or a rescue crew. It was the rhythmic, measured click of heavy combat boots hitting the porch. I rushed to the front door, looking through the peephole. A dozen figures stood on my lawn, dressed in tactical gear that didn't bear any department markings. They weren't here to save me. They were here to sanitize the site. I backed away, my eyes darting around the hallway. I realized then that the safety I had sought was a fantasy. This house was a nexus, and I was the only witness left standing in the ruins. I looked down at the notebook in my hand, and as I flipped to the final page, my breath hitched. There was a Polaroid taped to the paper, taken from inside my own bedroom, dated just 3 hours ago. It was a photo of me, sleeping in my own bed with a red X marked across my face. The front door groaned under the pressure of a hydraulic ram. I had seconds. I turned to run toward the back exit, but as I reached the kitchen, the floor beneath me didn't just creak. It fell away entirely, revealing a hidden stairwell I had never known existed, leading down into the darkness of a sub-basement that was glowing with the soft, steady hum of dozens of monitors. I stepped down, the heavy door slamming shut behind me, effectively sealing me inside a room that looked like a military command center. And in the center of the room, sitting in my old office chair, was a man who looked exactly like Mark, but with a cold, terrifying smile that I had never seen before. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up, Sarah," he said, turning the chair to face me. "We've been waiting a long time to show you how deep this rabbit hole really goes." The man in the chair didn't just look like Mark. He was a mirror reflection. The same bone structure, the same sharp jawline, but behind the eyes, where my ex-husband had only ever held insecurity and greed, this man held the cold, calculating stillness of a predator. He was the architect of everything that had been dismantled today. My breath hitched, my lungs burning from the dust of the collapsing house above, but I didn't back away. I had spent 8 years being the victim in their story. I was done playing the role. "You're not Mark," I said, my voice steadying. "You're the one who kept him on a leash. You're the one who orchestrated the framing, the internal audits, and this entire house of cards." The man stood, his movements fluid and precise. "Mark was a tool, Sarah, a blunt instrument we used to secure the property. You were the anomaly, the one who actually owned the deed. You see, the original owners of this land buried a digital ledger here decades ago, a ledger that tracks every offshore account, every bribe, and every illicit transaction tied to this city's elite. You didn't just buy a house, you bought the vault." He walked toward me, his boots clicking on the metal grating of the sub-basement floor. I gripped the leather-bound notebook Leo had left for me. I realized now that Leo hadn't just been my brother. He was the one who had been leaking the data, the one who had been fighting this war from the inside of their own facility. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Where is my brother?" "He's exactly where he wants to be," the man replied, gesturing to the monitors that lined the walls. They were flickering with lines of code, the ledger. "He's currently uploading the entire database to a public server. He traded his life for a whistle blow. He thought he could outmaneuver us." The man reached for a secondary console, his thumb hovering over a red toggle. But he forgot one thing. The house is rigged to incinerate the data if the primary security breach is detected. You're the failsafe, Sarah. Your heart rate, your biometric signature. It's all linked to the self-destruct sequence. If you die, the house erases everything. I looked at the screens. I saw a progress bar. Upload 98%. I didn't think about survival anymore. I thought about justice. I turned and ran toward the main server rack, not away from him, but toward the central cooling unit I'd noticed the moment I stepped down. I knew the layout of this house better than anyone. I had lived in it, I had maintained it, and I had felt the structural shifts of its foundation for years. "Don't!" The man lunged, his cool facade cracking into frantic desperation. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall bracket and swung it with everything I had into the glass housing of the cooling system. Liquid nitrogen sprayed out in a freezing white plume, coating the server racks in frost. The hum of the monitors turned into a high-pitched, screeching whine. The screens turned red. Critical system error. Upload forced to external drive. The progress bar jumped. 99%. 100%. The man stopped, his face draining of color as a chime sounded, a soft melodic tone that signaled the end of the upload. His phone began to vibrate, then another, then every device in the room. He looked at his screen, his hands trembling. The ledger was public. Every name, every offshore account, every criminal association was being broadcasted to news outlets, federal agencies, and international watchdogs. "You've destroyed us," he whispered. "I didn't destroy anything," I said, backing toward the service ladder that led to the storm drain beneath the property. "I just stopped you from hiding." The sub-basement began to groan. The fail-safe, the thermal charge was triggering. I didn't wait for him to react. I scrambled up the ladder, the metal biting into my palms, and burst out into the cool, damp air of the storm tunnel just as the house above us roared. A deep tectonic vibration shook the ground, and for a moment I saw the sky through the hole I'd climbed out of. Then the house settled, its foundations folding inward as the sub-basement was swallowed by the earth, taking the man, the secrets, and the lies down with it. I crawled through the tunnel until I reached the street, emerging into the crisp night air. Sirens were everywhere, a cacophony of flashing lights, red and blue, reflecting off the shattered remains of my home. My neighborhood was crawling with federal agents, but these were the real ones. A figure stepped out from behind a squad car. It was Leo. He looked battered, his clothes torn and stained with soot, but he was standing. I ran to him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim of a circumstance I couldn't control. I felt like the person who had finally drawn the line. "It's done. Leo said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The network is falling. They're arresting everyone on that list." I looked at the wreckage of my house, my former life. Arthur, Brenda, and Mark were already in cuffs, their faces twisted in defeat as they realized the full scope of their fall. The investigators who had come to sanitize the scene were being swarmed by armed agents. "I lost everything," I said, looking at the pile of debris. "No," Leo replied, handing me a small, heavy envelope he'd pulled from his jacket. "You lost a building, but you kept the truth. And this?" He pointed to the envelope. "This is the deed to a new beginning. Everything we recovered from their holdings has been tied to a trust in your name. You aren't just free, Sarah. You're the one who owns the future now." I took the envelope, feeling the weight of it. I didn't look back at the ruins. I turned and walked toward the edge of the police tape, the cool night wind against my face, finally feeling the silence of a life that was entirely and truly my own. The story wasn't about the house, or the deed, or the secrets they tried to bury. It was about the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to save me and realized that the only power that mattered was the one I'd had all along, the power to say no.